So, Renato, does the cell site location data that Trump's team provided in Fulton County prove that the prosecutors there were lying about when their relationship started?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a tweet. So, Asha, I thought, this motion and all of the back and forth about historical cell site information in the Fulton County case was an interesting thing for us to talk about, because it seems like most people really don't know much about it.
No, and it's both interesting from sort of a conceptual Fourth Amendment point of view, and how it relates, to this case, if it does at all. And I think in what you can learn from it, which I know you know a lot about.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think a lot of us listening here are going to be like, oh my God, this again, why is this going down this rabbit hole? It ultimately matters because the judge is taking this seriously. I think the judge is concerned that maybe there's been an attempt to deceive him. And yes, that would be a very foolish move by the prosecutors in this case if they made that decision. But nonetheless, the information being relied upon is information that is used in thousands of criminal cases every year across this country. I was using it many years ago when I was a younger junior federal prosecutor, and it was a pioneering technique back then, but it is now something that is used frequently by prosecutors across the country.
Yeah, sure. So why don't you explain what it is and what the kind of data, or what this kind of data tells us? Like, what is the information that it provides investigators?
Sure. Well, let's put as a starting point, everyone I think understands that their cell phone does help people locate them, right? A lot of people have used something like Find My iPhone or the Android equivalent of that to find their iPhone, or maybe to keep track of their kids and their phones or things like that, family members, that sort of thing. That sort of location information that's transmitted from your phone is real-time GPS information that can determine your location with pinpoint accuracy in real time. That sort of information is available to law enforcement, but it has to be done on an ongoing basis, a future basis. So in other words, I used to, for example, investigate kidnappings in progress in my portion of the country, in the Northern District of Illinois. I would have to rush to a judge, get a court order or a search warrant. This is before the key case that I know we'll end up talking about here, Carpenter. I would get a search warrant, and I would get the phone company to provide real-time location information on a phone, kind of like Find My iPhone or something, but for the bad guy's phone in real time. We could literally within like 10 meters locate the person who had kidnapped someone. This is different. The information that was provided in Fulton County is not that way, but it's historical information, which makes it very valuable, because a lot of times when you're trying to investigate a crime, you don't find out about the crime till after it occurred. So if you're trying to find out, for example, whether a particular individual was the one robbing a bank at a particular time, you can actually issue, in this case it was a subpoena. We'll talk more about the legal standard later, but you can get records from the phone company that show for each phone call made by the phone, what cell tower that phone connected to at the beginning of the call, as well as the orientation in which it hit the tower. In other words, every cell tower typically has like three sectors, essentially. Let's just say A, B, and C, or it might be northwest, southeast, that sort of thing. And essentially, you can almost pinpoint a phone within a certain like it'll give you a directional element. So you could say this slice, it's not just, you can pinpoint, let's say that this phone was within 2 miles of the tower, but you might be able to pinpoint that this phone was actually southeast of the tower or northwest. What that does is establish the phone in a particular area at a particular time.
I was going to say what it can do is help triangulate, right? Like it can give, if you have different towers, you know the direction, then there's going to be some overlapping areas that all converge. And I guess it really depends on the saturation of cell phones in that particular area. That's going to give you the radius that you can actually triangulate.
Yeah, it's a smart point. The saturation of the cell towers matters. If you're in the middle of a rural area, there may only be one cell tower, but in a very densely packed urban area, there are more. It also depends on how often you are making calls. And so, but it's best, it can really be very probative in certain circumstances. I investigated a crime family that was traveling around the country committing crimes, and their phone always seemed to be in the town or, where the crime was being committed. That's highly probative. But for example, if you're trying to determine, what somebody was doing in Manhattan, there may be so many cell towers, and it really may not tell you a whole heck of a lot.
So just so that our listeners understand why this was brought up and what the purported relevance is, once again, we're back to the timeline of Fani Willis's relationship with Special Prosecutor Nathan Wade. And the assertions made by both Wade and Willis is that their relationship started in 2022 after she had hired him. So in other words, this is trying to undercut any accusation that they had a prior relationship and she hired him knowing that somehow, that he was going to benefit financially and then she would benefit or something like that. Anyway, the point is that the timeline matters in terms of the assertions and representations they made to the court. And what Trump's lawyers are trying to show with this cell site location data is, look, there were 12,000. You probably have the numbers that were in the filing. I mean, there were thousands of, cell phone pings in the vicinity of Fani Willis's house by Nathan Wade's cell phone. And then I think they also mentioned that there were thousands of interactions between their devices as well. And this all was taking place in 2021. This is going to this shows, according to Trump's lawyers, that their relationship predated the time that he was hired, which not only they say goes to their claim that there's, a conflict of interest, but also now, if that were true, that they lied to the court. And so that's why what this particular data shows exactly and whether the judge is going to consider it becomes important.
Yeah, it's a really important point. And this data, by the way, is used in court cases across the country, not just the historical cell site information, but as you point out, Asha, what we call the call detail records. And I used to use that as a prosecutor as well. It's like, why are these individuals contacting each other hundreds of times a day? It's like, well, my contention is that they were conducting some big time drug deal. Their contention is that they just were that enthusiastic about the Chicago Cubs or whatever they were discussing, getting pizza together or something that they thought that they claimed that they were discussing so urgently. So this is similar. I mean, there's nothing criminal about being in an adult relationship between consenting adults, but nonetheless, here they made a representation to the court, and the attorneys are like, hey, these people are contacting each other a heck of a lot for people who supposedly aren't in a relationship. And this guy seems like he's in the general location of her residence, and this goes to show, it's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not the standard, but it goes to show that maybe he's not telling the truth and she's not telling the truth to the court.
And I think it was a 9-mile radius of her house. Yeah. And it wasn't just the volume of connections made by his phone to that vicinity and the interactions between their devices, but also that the time at which these were taking place were very, very late at night or very, very early in the morning. In other words, it's not just, during happy hour, like after work or something like that. So they're trying to paint a picture here. And before we get into what you think this goes, like how you think this plays out, it might be worth talking about what Fani Willis's response was to this, which is that the judge should not admit this information into evidence for this hearing and consider it because, she said that it's not probative, and you can talk about that, Renato. But she made this interesting argument where she challenged the legality by which the Trump team got those records. And this is because that law enforcement is not able to get this kind of information without getting a search warrant from a court. And there's just a really interesting history. This is a really cool, and, I teach this case, Carpenter versus the United States, from 2012, because under existing Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, what your Fourth Amendment rights are really based on this idea of a reasonable expectation of privacy over the information being sought. And as Renato just explained, for things like the number of interactions between, two cell phones for their texts, that is different than knowing the content of what was actually being said. And so the court has generally looked at what is the kind of information that's being sought, and also, have you voluntarily essentially given this over to a third party, understanding that somebody else has this information? So, when you dial a phone number, the phone company knows the numbers that you're dialing. You don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy over the numbers that you dial. And I think the idea leading up to Carpenter was, you also know that when you're using your cell phone, that the cell phone towers are gathering this information, that your cell phone company is getting this information. And I think there's also this underlying assumption in history that you don't really have a reasonable expectation of privacy in your physical movements in public. As an FBI agent, I could follow somebody around all day, and that was fine. And what was really interesting about this case is they said, well, it's true that you might know that you're giving this information over, but because modern technology has gotten to a point where it can literally follow you anywhere, it is an invasion of privacy for the government to be able to get this information without a warrant, because it's getting into some of the most intimate parts of your life. Like, they can essentially follow you into not just public spaces, but private spaces. They can see like where you're going. And also, I think what was really interesting about this case was it talks about kind of the changing balance of power between law enforcement and the individual as a result of technology, that because of the amount of data that can be gathered, as Renato just said, you can go back in history and like really create a whole big picture of someone's day-to-day life, really, and what they've been doing and where they've been and all that. And so they kept that, they weirdly kept the reasonable expectation of privacy standard and this whole third party, you're handing it over, jurisprudence in place. They didn't overturn anything, but they kind of created this whole new category for cell site location information. And that's why Fani Willis said, well, how did Trump get this? Because law enforcement, I mean, she's a prosecutor. She's probably had to get this too. Law enforcement would need a warrant. But of course, Trump is not acting as the government here. So I'm curious what you think. I mean, could his lawyers just get this with a subpoena?
The short answer is yes. And, it's an interesting thing, by the way. I think you explained it very well, Asha. I was involved in a lot of debates within DOJ in 2009 to 2011 when I was prosecutor there. This is before Carpenter, about what we're going to do with this information, because technically speaking, you didn't need a warrant at that time for this. And we would just issue for call detail records. In other words, the phone contacts between phones, we would just send a subpoena. So what about historical cell site information? And there were a lot of people, very senior, smart people within the Justice Department who were like, hey, people are giving this to AT&T. We're not asking individuals for their information. We're asking AT&T or Verizon or Sprint for this information. There's no reasonable expectation of privacy for Sprint's records on somebody else. So I think, it's the sort of thing that really is a creature of, as you point out, the unique way in which government's surveillance of the individual has increased, right? And, in the past, you'd have to have the expense of having FBI agents follow somebody around. Now, cheaply, you can follow everybody. And I think the government, the court was concerned about that. So, yes, in the government context, it requires a warrant, but a private party, they could subpoena this information. They do subpoena this sort of information. It is used, I think, sometimes maybe in divorce proceedings and things like that. Here, it was being used for this purpose. I don't think that her argument's very good here, and I think Trump's attorneys are going to win on this point. Now, I think a lot of people, listeners at home, are like, "Oh my God, why does this even matter? Why are we talking about somebody's personal relationship?" And I think that's a fair point, but the judge seems to care. I think the path of the Georgia case is going to be determined by how the judge perceives this, because if the judge thinks that Willis and Wade are lying to him, he may just decide that they have to recuse themselves, and then a new prosecutor is not as enthusiastic about this matter may take it over.
Yes. So what about, I hear what you're saying is her legal argument that, this was illegally obtained is probably unavailing if it was totally fine for his lawyers to get it with a subpoena. But what do you think about what it actually shows? I mean, it seems relevant, but at what point would you look at this and the representations that are being made and conclude that the nature of their relationship, began in 2021? And I mean, how would you even determine the nature of that relationship? I mean, you don't know that they're in each other's presence. Maybe they're friends. I mean, I don't think there was any dispute that they knew each other before this or that they were friends.
Right. Well, you also could have an emotional relationship with someone that's not physical. So does that count?
Right.
Right. I don't know. Because Fani Willis had a fairly famous quote about right when relationships end and how that's in the eye of the beholder. It's a good question. I guess I'll think maybe to help our listeners think about this, I'll pose a question to you, Asha. Let's say that your boyfriend, you were suspected that your boyfriend had a relationship with somebody else, and you got this data, and it showed that he was speaking hundreds of times, or not speaking, his phone was in contact with her phone hundreds of times late at night, and his phone was within, 6 miles, 8 miles of her residence, which was not at his, not right where his was. There was some distance involved in the evenings. What would you conclude? Would you think that was evidence? Would you disregard that evidence? Or would you think it was probative?
Well, I'd be pissed. But
there you go.
But here's what I would say. I mean, I think you would need to look at is there any reason for them to be in this frequent contact? Right. So we know they know each other. I mean, that's a lot of time. One of the things that Fani Willis notes in her filing, in all caps, which was a little weird, was that this was right around the time that, was it the grocery store mass shooting took place at that time?
Okay. I don't remember.
I believe that's, but she references a mass shooting or a major shooting that was I guess getting national attention. He's a prosecutor. If there's look, I text you when I have a legal question or if I want to kind of talk something through.
True. My wife's not concerned, but
Your
yes,
wife is not
we don't
concerned.
talk hundreds of times.
We don't talk hundreds and thousands of times. No, but my point is, we have a working relationship. We have reasons to be in communication with each other. if there was a spike in those communications, say, a big case comes down about Trump or something like that, I mean, you might see a flurry of interactions. And I don't know, if I lived in Chicago, maybe I'd happen to be kind of around your vicinity. I don't know. I'm not defending. I'm just giving the other side of the argument here. Like, in other words, how much does the judge look at this? Is it really the triangulation, the 9-mile radius? Is it the frequency of the contacts? Without knowing the content and without really, as you said, defining very clearly what does the beginning of a relationship mean,
I think just looking at the motion and just seeing the dispute between the sides, the information clearly comes in. I mean, I agree there may be an alternative explanation to it, but I don't see how the data doesn't come in to evidence. So that I think is an easy call. There is this issue where the defense wants to put up, Trump's team wants to put up a person to explain this data, and they say it's not an expert. And this is also a common battle in trials is this really an expert or is this a summary witness? In other words, if I'm just putting up a bunch of charts, like let's say I have my assistant create a bunch of charts out of data, just do some basic arithmetic. And I decide that like we're putting those charts into evidence and she's going to walk you through the math. That's not really expert testimony. She's just sort of summarizing things. There's a difference between that and somebody's providing expertise. I will tell you, I used to train FBI agents to be experts in this space. Our view, the Justice Department view at that time, back in that time period I told you, pre-Carpenter, was this had to be expert testimony because they were offering an opinion about what this meant about the radius of a tower and yada, yada, yada. Could see the judge very carefully cabining that piece of this, because that is also part of the motion here, is whether or not that witness is excluded. But I don't know how much that matters at the end of the day. And I do think that how probative it is depends on the alternative explanation provided. We got about the cash issue, which was also raising some eyebrows. This explanation from her dad and her about carrying a lot of cash and why this is totally makes sense in their experience. I don't know. I mean, maybe this guy had a lot of wisdom that he was providing or whatever, but it's definitely, she's got some explaining to do, so to speak.
Yeah. And I just always go back to what a poor, idea this was. Along a number of different dimensions, because wouldn't you expect that this would come out in some way? And whether or not the interpretation is accurate, as we've talked about many times before, perception can be as important as reality when it comes to people believing in the impartial administration of justice. And I think in that regard, I've said it before, Trump is an information warrior. He's won just by making this now the story.
I agree with that.
And not just making it a story, but making it a actual material issue that could impact the outcome of the case.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I will say that I view this issue about the timing of the relationship at an even other level than the relationship itself. In other words, they made a bad decision by having a relationship during this time period. But once you've made that decision, okay, and you had the relationship, when you know that the defense is looking into this and investigating the issue, if they did in fact, and it hasn't been established, but if they did in fact mislead or lie to the court about the starting time of that relationship, that is really effing dumb. Like, that is about as dumb as it gets. So I really hope for their sake that they did not do that, because that is just beyond unforced error. Like, that is just pure stupidity. So, Asha, we had a lot of other topics to discuss this week, and trying to decide between a couple of them was hard. So I guess we have Prosecution Potpourri.
Smells like justice.
There you go. It smells like justice indeed. So I'll start with one that I think is interesting. We do have the list, the notice that has been filed in the court just yesterday in the Manhattan DA's case from Trump's team. They've filed their notice of his motions in limine. Motions in limine are the list of motions that are filed in advance of trial. And essentially, it's asking the court to rule on issues in advance, like evidentiary issues, so that the trial can be more efficient and orderly. So those issues don't come up or pop up in the middle of the trial. And we don't know what the motions are yet. We don't know the specifics of the motions, but they have explained what those motions are. So my favorite one is number 1, Michael Cohen perjury. The people, this is the prosecution, should be precluded from subverting additional perjury by Michael Cohen. I feel like that goes right to the point you were just making about disinformation, right? Isn't that just purely about creating a story about Michael Cohen?
100%.
Yeah. You can't know what he's going to say, what Cohen's going to say. Their claim is that it's untruthful, but this is just, I think, a way of packaging that up. I think the most interesting one, though, is one in which they essentially argue that the prosecution, and I'm going to quote from their filing, should be precluded from arguing that President Trump sought to improperly influence, they put that in quotes, the 2016 election. They say it was nothing untoward or irregular and certainly nothing criminal about his winning candidacy supported by tens of millions of Americans. So essentially, what their argument is here, this is a common issue in criminal trials, is the prosecution is just as to this very narrow issue. So the government should not be able to argue about all of these bad things that are kind of around it. In other words, you've just charged me or my client with this very narrow transaction and a narrow date. You can't talk about his, massive scheme. You can't talk about all the impacts on it. You can't try to talk about all these things around it. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to draw a circle around what happened in this particular case with the hush money payments and trying to say that that's all the government could talk about.
Well, and then that basically means that the government wouldn't be able to present their theory of the case, because what they want to do is explain the motive, right? That all of these reimbursements to Michael Cohen were concealed because they did not want it to become known that she was being silenced for her story in advance of the election. And I would guess that Bragg is also going to say that this is exactly why Trump didn't just pay her back directly. So it seems like that's going to be a losing battle to not allow the government to present the motive that Trump would have to create. I mean, obviously he did create this very complex arrangement for no reason. But I think to your point earlier about the perjury thing, it tells me that they're very concerned about the narrative that's going to come out in the court of public opinion, I think, as much as the court of law in terms of the reporting. Because, of course, the last thing you want going into an election is a story that resurfaces how Trump tried to subvert the election in 2016. And I think we've noted that that's the way that Bragg makes this case relevant to right now, too.
That's right. I think that's the important point. I was just going to say that myself, Asha. I think you and I are thinking alike. Is that, one issue that I think both of us have had at times with this Manhattan DA case is kind of like old news, right? He's like charging something that happened pre-2016 election. And it's really hard to explain to a jury, like, what are we doing here? Like, why are we here? Why does this matter? That's an important part of every prosecution. Prosecution has to convince the jury, like, why does this matter? Sometimes it's obvious, like someone was murdered, but other times it's not. And this is one of those times. And I think Bragg and his team are really planning, I think, to push hard on the idea that this subverted our electoral system. And I think the defense is wisely putting a shot across the bow. And I'm going to say, Asha, that I'm sure they hope they win this. I don't think they expect to win, but I actually think what they're doing is putting a marker down or kind of putting this issue on the judge's radar. What I think they're hoping is even if they lose, the judge is going to be mindful of this and watch what the prosecution says. And similarly, Bragg's team is going to be very thoughtful and careful, more thoughtful and careful than they otherwise would have been about how they argue this issue. Because they're essentially setting up an issue about an appeal or so forth where they say Trump was essentially being put on trial for something he wasn't charged with, something beyond what he was actually charged with. And that's why the jury convicted, not because of the evidence in the case.
Doesn't that happen a lot, though?
It does happen. And
like, I mean, if I'm prosecuting somebody for murder, like they murder their wife and she found out that he was falsifying, whatever, their taxes and he had to kill her because she was going to talk, even if the person hasn't been charged for the other illegal behavior that he was trying to conceal by killing the spouse, I assume that you'd be able to bring that in as the motive.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Yes. I mean, so for motive, yes. Secondly, you certainly in this case, because the other crime matters here, right? In other words, these were falsification of business records, and it's a felony if it's done to promote another crime, I believe, or something along those lines. Conceal another crime. So that could be part of the element that they have to prove. However, the question is, how do you argue that in closing, and what arguments is the government making? Like, certain arguments by the government are improper. Like, hey, this guy committed this murder. Okay, that's fine. But then if you're like, you need to keep your neighborhood safe because this guy is involved in some spree of whatever, he's dangerous, that's not proper. And I think if they're trying to argue that you need to save our electoral system from Donald Trump because he subverts our electoral system, and this is part of it, something along those lines, that's problematic. And so I think that the defense is trying to put a shot across the bow so that Bragg's team is arguing the stuff in an artful way. There are clever ways in which you can argue this in a way that hits the elements, but still gets across that message to the jury. And that's really what Bragg's team should be doing if they're smart and savvy prosecutors. And I think the defense is sort of circling like vultures, waiting for a time where they maybe step over the line or do this inartfully.
Yes. So next up in prosecution potpourri.
Is this the bark, the tree bark part, or the cinnamon? Okay, keep going. Sorry. For the potpourri. Okay, I said Corey. Yeah, stepdad joke. Okay, move on. All right.
No, I know I know where you were going with that. So I want to talk about Alexander Smirnov, who is the former star witness of James Comer's impeachment inquiry, who turns out to be a conduit of Russian disinformation. And he was charged with lying to the FBI. He is the one who basically made the explosive allegation that Joe Biden received bribes while he was vice president in order to stop a prosecutor in Ukraine from investigating Burisma while his son was on the board. And that his son used the position on the board to basically stop this investigation. It's the same recycled narrative that we've heard since Trump's impeachment, over the Zelensky impeachment one. But what's extraordinary is that at the very end of the indictment, Smirnov not only tries to change his story because the FBI has figured out that it's all a lie. He's like, oh yeah, by the way, I met with 4 Russian officials, and they may have recordings of Hunter Biden in Kiev. And I read that and I was like, okay, this is that's crazy. And then it turns out, in arguing to the court that he should not be released pending trial, the government has said that he has basically Russian contacts. He's acting in some way as basically an agent of Russia. And it's just extraordinary that we have basically had a vector of Russian disinformation injected directly into congressional proceedings. Now, not just any congressional proceedings, an impeachment effort of a sitting U.S. president. I mean, we are just in crazy town right now. And, you know, I'm not rushing to collusions or anything, but okay, sorry. I have been waiting like 6 years to use that.
Oh my
good. God. But I think we have to be very wary of how, you know, when you combine that with the withholding of aid from Ukraine, the crazy comments that Trump has been making, you know, I'm just very alarmed at the alignment and almost unabashed promotion of Russia's preferred talking points in our political processes.
Yeah, I mean, look, this should be embarrassing to the Republican Congress people who are pushing impeachment. I will note that some of them have scrubbed their websites of a reference to this guy. He was supposedly the star witness. We heard so much of this whistleblower, FBI whistleblower. Turns out the guy is a liar, or at least alleged by the government to be, by the DOJ to be a liar. Appears to be a liar. But in any event, it is a sad thing for our country. And it's really a par for the course. Like as you point out, this is what Trump was, pressuring, threatening Ukraine to dig up info regarding. The Russians ended up serving this up, to the Republicans in the House. They ran with it. And I guess, is it any wonder that the Republicans in the House are withholding aid from Ukraine, and Trump is trying to, undermine NATO and say that we're not going to defend our NATO allies? Just it all seems to line up in the same direction.
And just to put a cherry on top, the irony of this all is that the FBI began investigating these claims aggressively because James Comer and Chuck Grassley knew that this reporting existed from way back in the day, which the FBI got back in like 2020, didn't find anything there. I have to wonder why that was not pursued more aggressively then to determine whether he was lying about a presidential candidate. But anyway, they quietly closed the case. To me, this is the real scandal. Under Bill Barr's administration, just quietly let this, I guess this informant stayed on the books and just quietly shut it, filed it away. Then Comer and Grassley said, why isn't the FBI looking into this? This is another example of the deep state. So the FBI basically hands this over to David Weiss, the special counsel who's investigating all the Hunter Biden stuff. And lo and behold, they did investigate it very aggressively and found out the guy is lying, and it got blown open. So be careful what you wish for. And I really think that the big scandal here is that this person was not exposed for being a liar and a conduit of Russian disinformation much earlier by the FBI itself.
Yeah, I will say there's a lot of information provided to the FBI that sits in a report on a system somewhere. And whether it's true or not, who knows? I mean, the FBI gets a lot of information from a lot of people. They're not usually running around trying to determine whether everybody who talks to them is a liar or not, whether their charges are warranted. It's almost like people who submit false tax returns or things like that. There's only a fraction of them who are caught and prosecuted. And here's a case where I think, as you point out, the amount of information and attention put on, regarding this from Republicans is ironically what led to this guy's prosecution. And speaking, by the way, of deceptive people who are, aiding Republican disinformation efforts, our friend Kenneth Chesborough, whatever his name is, we haven't talked about him for a while, so we haven't had to discuss his cheesy name for a period of time. But he apparently, it was just revealed a couple days ago or a day ago, had a burner Twitter account that he's using was following a lot of us and attacking our views on democracy and so forth. And basically, he lied to Michigan investigators who were investigating the false elector scheme by saying that he wasn't, essentially saying things that the opposite of what he was saying in this account, which he was using to promote as a disinformation about the role of electors in in the electoral efforts, or the electoral subversion efforts of Donald Trump during the 2020 election.
Now, what was the name of this account? Because it sounded vaguely familiar to me.
It was something Badger something or other, right? Wasn't it like something Pundit? Badger? Yeah, Badger Pundit. So supposedly a Wisconsinite, I suppose. I don't know if he's actually from Wisconsin. He had like a little logo that he had made for it, like BP or something.
And he attacked you at some point.
He did. In fact, the tweet, I found out about this because I got a bunch of mentions in Twitter. Apparently, people were going back to see what tweet he had responded to, and the tweet mentioned in the CNN article was my tweet that he replied to. I was just saying that this is a threat to our democracy. These fake electors. And he responded saying, no, this is part of the Constitution. And, this is, total. And in fact, he tagged Randy Garnett, who's a right-wing professor law professor trying to get support for this idea that, hey, this is totally normal. This is what people do, is they try to put up alternate slates of electors, even if they lost the state and the election in the state. It's quite bizarre, but it goes to show that disinformation element, it really comes, you mentioned in the last one, Asha, this last Smirnov, that's a nation state.
Correct.
Russia sponsoring disinformation. But I really think, it's become internalized within the Republican Party. And here's a guy who didn't he graduate from Harvard Law School?
Yeah. I believe so.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
and he sort of wants his own advancement so much that he's willing to lie and try to deceive the public, and apparently Michigan state investigators to accomplish that. It's absolutely crazy.
It is really insane. And I think, I think when we get to the point where the lawyers are the ones that are doing this stuff, like, it really depresses me.
It's really something. I mean, there is definitely this notion that lawyers are held to a higher standard and we're officers of the court and so forth. And, having lawyers use their skills to try to move forward an effort to subvert our Constitution and our democracy, I mean, it's just highly disturbing.
True. Once again, the chief stands alone. So before we go, Renato, I just had a fun weekend with my adult friends in Disney World.
Wait, you went to Disney World without children?
With no children.
Okay. Well, what's up with that, Asha? That's a little sus. What's going on?
So one of my good college friends was celebrating his 50th birthday. And what he wanted to do for his 50th birthday was he wanted to do drinks around the world at Epcot Center. I did not know this was a thing. Have you ever heard of this?
No, because I'm over the age of 18, so I don't take trips.
So drinks around the world is you go to what is it called? Parade of Nations, the World Showcase in Epcot Center. Have you been to Epcot Center?
I've been to Epcot Center years ago, yes.
Yeah, so basically there's two different sides. One has like different exhibitions and rides on, kind of different areas. And then the other side is a World Showcase, and they have different countries, I think 12 different countries that all go in like a semicircle. And drinks around, and each country, it has cuisine, it has stores. They literally only hire people who are nationals of that country to work there. And interestingly, as an aside, there's a lawsuit against Disney right now because during COVID, they weren't giving these H-1B visas for people to work there. So they were all, Americans. And then once things opened up, they fired all the Americans and hired people from those countries to work there. So now there's a lawsuit against Disney for discriminating on the basis of national origin against Americans, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, but among the many things that each country has is, signature beverages from the country. And so drinks around the world is that you start at one end and you have a drink in each country and you work your way around.
So I was trying to tease you because it's obviously like that's more. I don't know. I view Disney World as like a kid's thing, but I get the appeal of it. I get the appeal of it. I can't say that I would choose that for my 50th birthday. If my wife is listening, please do not make that my 50th birthday thing. But I get it. So did you actually have fun at Epcot Center?
It was fun. I definitely had to have a drinking strategy because we started at 11 o'clock and I was like, I don't know how this is going to work. So I had a friend who was there with me, another college friend, and we decided to share drinks. And sometimes we even shared it with a third person. So, but we always got something that was very like that country, like either a cocktail that was that country or a beer from that country. So like we started in Canada and it was like what's called an Ottawa apple.
Okay. I was thinking Labatt's. Okay. I don't know. All right.
No. Lovely drink. But, I only had like this much and there was ice in it. So
yeah.
I was able to make it through, but I did not actually make it through all 12 countries. I was kind of
It's a lot of drinks. 12 drinks?
It's a lot of drink. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, the pomegranate mimosa in Morocco was nice.
Okay.
A violet sake in Japan. I mean, they were fun drinks. If you're just having a few sips.
And then did you like go on rides and that sort of thing, or no?
I did go on rides. So I went on a roller coaster like halfway through the day. This Guardians of Galaxy roller coaster, which was kind of and it had like, it has like different G-forces and stuff. I don't know. It was crazy. So I was really glad that I had not had too much alcohol by that point.
So I was at a place called Cedar Point a number of years ago, and there's all these roller coasters that are a little much for me, and so I'm like, okay, I'll have a couple drinks. That's gonna take the edge off. I'm gonna enjoy these rides way more. Oh no, that did not go very well. It went very much the opposite direction. So I was kind of curious how that worked out for you.
Yeah, but it was fun. And it was fun to go and just have like a different focus than when you go with your kids. Because honestly, at this point, Disney is really complicated. Like, you need a freaking PhD in Disney to understand how to work the system so that you don't wait in line for like 3 hours.
That's interesting. See, I will say the one part of it that is cool to me as an adult is like they have that whole Star Wars area where they like made it like Star Wars, like you're in it and it's immersive. Like that seems super cool to me as a Star Wars nerd. I like that. I don't know if they have something similar for Marvel. I know that their competitor has the Harry Potter one, right? Universal Studios. But I mean, a lot of the stuff that like the more traditional stuff, like it's. Even when I was in high school, I found that kind of like lame, right? Like Magic Kingdom, like when you're at a certain point, once you're an adult, like it's hard to get into it.
I think that Disney Imagineers have come up with a lot of cool different things. So there's a lot of sort of, virtual reality or ways in which they have rides that are kind of very immersive. And it's cool. It is cool that I think that they have, updated a lot of the rides to using like new technology. So the Guardians of Galaxy roller coaster was actually really, really cool.
I can see that. I mean, it's Marvel.
It felt like you were floating through space is basically what it felt like.
That's pretty cool.
MSW Media.